Dreher continues, "Good morning. It's COVID day 5 for me, and I want to tell myself that this is getting better. My throat doesn't hurt anymore, and maybe my voice is coming back a little. But I also know from this week's experience that there's no predicting what any day is going to be like. I presume I have the Omicron version, the one responsible for 90% of new infections in Louisiana. And if so, man, I gotta say, if this is the weak version, thank God I took precautions and didn't get one of the stronger versions. This stuff is kicking my butt hard. I slept all day yesterday, which is just as well, because my area had a day-long internet outage. Now my family members are waiting for the Omicron bomb to drop on them. Let me discourage anybody from saying, quote, it's just a flu, or it's just a bad head cold. I have experienced nothing worse than the flu, but still, do you remember having the flu? It's not fun. On the flip side, I figured that I was going to get this super communicable Omicron variant no matter what precautions I took, because so many vaxxed and boosted people I know are coming down with it. And so I did, which is a relief in a way because I will have acquired some natural immunity. But I also have at least 2 friends who have had it twice. There's a paragraph break, and then just, quote, Xi Jinping, I will never forget you, end quote.
And I like this deeply sensual implication that Rod thinks having COVID is like letting Xi Jinping inside of him. It's really intense to imagine, Rod Dreher, uh, sweating through the third layer of his bedding or something, as the face of Xi Jinping swims above him somewhere. But I think that this is one of the real burdens of the conservative blogosphere is to construct a lens through which the managerial class conservatives and giant McMansions with $80,000 pickup trucks can use to interpret the world, right? The type of person uniquely responsible for the no end in sight decay of rural America in a way low income MAGA chuds just could never be. And I think that's who Rod Dreher is really representing here, and it's remarkable to think about the contempt he must have for people in rural Louisiana. And it must be easier to just accept what the Omicron wave, did and is doing when you have a real job like Rod Dreher does. And I think it's here that we sort of get that peek behind the curtain, right? What Dreher is painting for us here of his little part of Louisiana near Baton Rouge, a place where they had a 1 day long internet outage while residents hunkered down for an Omicron wave. It really best country ever. You can
Yeah.
really tell, like, just from Rod Dreher looking from outside his window, chunking out another article that's mostly somebody else's writing, and like this one is, and while outside people just are like keeling over in the street.
And this brings us to the point of this update from the American Conservative, which is the rock Dreher's lived under since the National Review folded. We've actually read a bit from it already, and it's called Neckbeard Militias Are Not My Enemy. Dreher is in dialogue throughout with another conservative blogosphere critter called James Pogue, who attempts to describe the actual realities of civic violence in California's Red Belt.
And I think this piece is interesting to read when you're sort of forced to consider that it's likely neither of these guys have an interaction with someone who makes less than $250,000 a year. Like, these guys are trying to capitalize mostly off other more coastal conservatives' conflation of living in the flyover with being of average means.
Dreher writes about his bona fides as an everyman in order to weigh in on Pogue's complimentary description of the culture war in rural America. He writes, mind you, I live in the capital city, not the countryside anymore. But the cultural boundaries between city and country here in the Deep South are more porous than you might think. You could go stand at the downtown intersection of my tiny Louisiana hometown, dressed in drag, flying the pride flag, and screaming, Black trans lives matter. And the most people would do is laugh and wonder who your poor mama and daddy are, having a kid who acts like that. Go to the center of any Ivy League campus and fly the MAGA flag, and see how tolerated you are. For that matter, go to Times Square and try it. Yet those who run the culture in America keep telling themselves that they are the ones in danger.
A lot of what Dreher is dialoguing with here is Pogue's engagement with what Red Belt California is really like, and what the people there are actually likely to do in relation to the specter of civil war that keeps getting brought up, particularly I think by liberals. Like, I enjoy this sort of warped perception of what Dreher gives us here. He's unable to sort of live within the contradiction of Americans as being like demonstrably violent, right? But also politically bloodless. And I think that this is something that liberals are also a little bit confused about, which is that Americans actually aren't really willing to risk anything for anything. There may have been a time when a whole range of Americans had the civic ability to harness the power of the mob. But generations of liberals and conservatives like Rod Dreher, who've never experienced anything even approaching struggle, no chance. Absolutely no way.
Dreher continues, I'm old enough to remember the line that the George W. Bush administration repeated ad infinitum in its successful effort to convince the American people to support its war of choice on Iraq. That even though we can't be absolutely sure, we know what WMDs Saddam has. We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. My point is that the ruling class always has a reason to exaggerate threats, because that is what justifies its power and its power grabs. Along those lines, it is the left in power both in government and private industry that is moving on every possible front to make Americans more race conscious, suspicious, and antagonistic on race matters. This is why grown up men and women in the cathedral, to use the neo reactionary term for the establishment, actually believe that the MAGA yahoos of January 6th nearly overthrew the US government. You can believe, as I do, that what happened on that day was appalling and shameful without believing that, and Dreher switches now into Boomerlock, our democracy was in the crucible.
I just want to note that I think we made it through the entire month of January without mentioning January 6th on this show.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we had planned to talk about this particular reading series a couple of weeks back, but I am a little proud of us to have made it to this point without having to address it directly. But let's go ahead and unpack what Jer's talking about here, because he's dangerously close to making a point. And so, like, ignoring for a moment his insistence that like liberals or the Democratic Party constitute a left, we didn't talk about it a whole lot because frankly, the pitch and the tenor of MSNBC and liberals in the first week of this year, you know, was unbearable, right? And all of that hand wringing just over a day that a bunch of people wandered around the Capitol having coronaries and waiting to get kicked out by a bored Capitol police force is good evidence for what Jared's talking about here, actually. But no one on the actual left took January 6th seriously, right? And that's because we know that a disorganized militia.
It's like what did Chapo say that they were like? They called that. I think it was like the day after they ran like
Mhm.
an episode titled like "Accidental Soviets" or something like that.
Yes, and they basically were. But that's because but one of the reasons that I think people on the actual left, rather than the left that Dreher's talking about, weren't all that worried about it, because we understood, as Dreher points out, that some of the most comfortable and risk averse people were wandering around the Capitol
Yep.
building that day. And
Yep.
I think that this is like you got to understand the like
Mhm.
Washington D.C. protest tourist type,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a certain type of person out there that goes to Washington D.C. to
Mhm.
protest, particularly conservatives. I remember I like went to school with a kid whose family like picked up at the first week of the school year and like went to see the Glenn Beck rally back when Glenn Beck was sort of at like the height of his powers and everything. And these are like giant truck McMansion living conservative Mormons who, you know, who are just a little off, right? But who are ultimately like a threat to absolutely zero people. And I think that that's what everybody saw. But I think that Dreher is making the point that liberals, or the left as he terms it, have capitalized off of the fear of that. In fact, they've basically decided to run on it in these midterms. It's evidence of the fact that the Democratic Party is absolutely out of real offers and options to give to people at this point. That it really is just about what Dreher says here.
January 6th is such a weird historical event for me. I'm not agreeing with like Democrats on MSNBC sort of freaking out about it, like they did for the first week of January. In an unbearable, insufferable way. That like that's a thing. But at the same time though, I think there's a middle ground for me between like that and like the left not taking it seriously that I think is like an issue. Donald Trump still very much incited a riot that basically caused people, to do what they did. And yeah, like there were obviously there were very comfortable people, walking around in the Capitol. But I still think it highlighted and showed just how sort of rotten and decrepit and like how crumbly our institutions are. I think while the event itself was not as crazy and insane as, MSNBC and CNN and whoever else as much as they want to portray it, I still think what that event means is what people should be focusing on more instead of the event itself as they've
Mhm.
done. So 'cause I think it has broader implications with the election and everything that's been going on basically since
Mhm.
Trump lost,
Mhm.
and the Republicans and the right mobilizing to make it harder for people to vote on a nationwide effort. That to me is the scarier thing than January 6th. It just further highlighted this path that we are going down with our elections and stuff like
Mhm.
that. So
Yeah, I think that I agree that the January 6th incident does represent a certain degree of decay.
people are using it as like the epitome of decay, and
Mhm.
I
Or
don't
like it
necessarily.
was a beer hall putsch, right?
Right. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just a symptom of the larger theme of decay that's been going on.
Let me turn it around, though.
Yeah.
I don't understand why it doesn't happen more often.
You have to ask yourself with that question, why did that many people go to the Capitol for Donald Trump?
Mhm.
Why didn't they do it for Mitt Romney in 2012? You know?
Right. Well, and I think it's almost less sort of like about imagining a personality,
Yeah.
right? That, and I think that that Trump's person was unique, and all these sorts of things. I think that most conservatives, most people who would rise to the top of the Republican Party are not the type of people who would ask that of their supporters.
Yeah.
But I just mean that I think that the underlying frustration and disbelief and lack of credibility in our political system and our and its institutions has existed for a long time. And when you consider how sort of relatively open Congress is, the Supreme Court is, the actual literal halls of power, these aren't hard places to disrupt. In fact, they kind of have to be relatively open, in order to have this sort of patina of democracy, right? You can't secure the National Mall 365 with the National Guard in a country that's ostensibly, the symbol of civic freedom the world round. And these places have to be open in this way. And yet they are themselves completely lacking in credibility at this point. There's no correlation between public opinion and policy outcomes, hasn't been for a long time. Uh, there's, as you say, an effort to restrict voting, make it harder to access, and on top of that, the living conditions for Americans have been deteriorating year over year. And I'm not just sort of like, saying, oh, why aren't the people, outraged by this? I think that this has been a deeper current of American history. Like if you go back before the Second World War, people were basically willing to risk themselves in a civic sense, right? In these types of ways. You think about Whiskey Rebellion, Shays Rebellion, every like 3 years in the early republic, they were failing to pay like, militia members, and the militia members, would like take over the courthouse or whatever. And now, admittedly, the U.S. Constitution was written so that George Washington could, raise an army up against these types of people and crush them, right? But that's how deep it goes. That's how deep the sort of American impulse towards insurrection goes, right? And I'm not really even talking about like the type of elite insurrection that led the American Revolution, but I'm talking about just sort of like a day-to-day grassroots, dare I say, tendency towards insurrection.
I think you don't really see it as much now. It could be getting there more, but there's obviously a very, very long history of violent labor movements in the United States. And
And
I don't
violence
know.
being used against labor movements
Yes,
because of
exactly.
and because of how militantly organized those movements were.
Yeah. So I guess the way to look at that is, those events, those labor movements took place during, one of the most formative periods in American labor history.
It is only the post-war comfort of Americans
Yeah.
that has turned us broadly
Mhm.
in our sort of civic dimensions into a people who are basically unwilling to risk anything for anything.
Yeah.
So that now the only places where you kind of see that underlying current rear its head is in the disaffected and usually mentally ill, right? But that is, and so that's why, I think that if you wanted to sort of construct an argument for, the observable violence of American society and its vestiges, is to argue that actually an American population that's this risk averse is the historical exception, right? And it's
Mhm.
something that, like as you point out, has essentially only been around since the post-war consolidation and the deal that was offered to the average American for becoming docile and disorganized. We have this like sort of example, this historical example of a United States that is as violent as as liberals on MSNBC think it is, as even Rod Dreher sort of seems to think it is. Um, but what we have now, I mean, like I said, given that historical tradition, the idea that
Mhm.
an American insurgency is just a bunch of overweight people getting domed by Capitol police officers as they try to like ransack Nancy Pelosi's house and take Instagram pictures. I mean, it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic, right? And the idea that in this country with its history, that we would see anything here other than just another
Mhm.
one group of Pinkertons beating up a bunch of disorganized union
I
members.
think we've highlighted a little bit on kind of a broader point here too, because like you asked earlier, like, oh, why doesn't this happen more every day? You asked that question, and then I feel like you sort of answered it a little bit by what you just said there. A bunch of overweight people with their phones out, running around, live streaming them going into the Capitol and hanging out in Nancy Pelosi's office for social media,
Yep.
for technology. So it's like, and then everyone is watching this occur from the comfort of their own homes on Twitter, whatever. And like that's why it doesn't happen more, because even a violent riot is still happening within the confines of like comfortable technological use that we surround
Mhm.
ourselves with on like a daily basis. We've created such a bubble with social media and technology as human beings. And I'm not even really trying to make like a political point here. I'm just kind of highlighting the weirdness of technology,
Right.
because
It,
this is a theme that really transcends the political spectrum, because we're
Mhm.
all so ingrained into it at this
Right.
point. And it's again, it's like it's at some point in time, are we going to be ransacking the fucking White House on the fucking metaverse? Like,
Me
yeah,
watching you, watching me, watching you, overthrow the government. Yeah,
let's overturn the
yeah.
government on
On
metaverse.
Metaverse, yeah,
Yeah.
right. No, I
So
think I think that's an interesting prediction. distressingly, uh, maybe distressingly prescient.
Weird to think about the bizarre reality we've constructed around ourselves with technology on both sides of this. And we're sitting here talking about this virtually and making a podcast and doing something similar. So,
I mean, sure, but here's the thing: is that if it this would be the proof, right? Like if you wanted to say, like, okay, well, what would it look like if this wasn't just sort of like for the purposes of social media navel gazing in the eyes of the participants, right? Because I think you make a compelling argument that it was. If it weren't, here's what it might have looked like. If you're gonna do this with essentially no support from the state, right? Because like that's like, and let's just sidebar for a second to acknowledge that we understand on this show that an actual coup requires the support of some aspect of the state or capital, which is something that Trump didn't even have support of his own vice president, let alone the support of the military, let alone the support of the Capitol Police. The thing that actually makes an insurrection happen, the thing that
yeah.
actually makes a coup happen,
Mhm.
right? So let's put that out there. Anyone talking about this as an actual threat to overthrow the state is insane and disingenuous, right? But if you're going to do that, if you're going to go ahead and have an insurrection like this without the support of the state, and it's not just about social media navel gazing, then what you do is you take the main legislative chamber and you sit there and you legislate, even if it's entirely for show. You fill as many seats as you can in the chamber, and you sit there and you debate a docket of legislation until they literally pull you out.
Mhm.
That's what you do, and you say, "No, this is the state now. We in this room."
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is what the Bolsheviks did.
Mhm.
They just walked in and started making policy, and the state was too weak to haul them out, right? Like that's how an insurrection actually occurs without the support of the existing infrastructure. But they
Mhm.
didn't do that. It was just like my Facebook live stream of me eating Nancy Pelosi's Ben and Jerry's.
This is what I'm saying, like, we're heading towards our version of like
Yeah.
a Ready Player One type scenario
Hmm.
where we're, like I said, just, storming the Capitol on Metaverse or whatever. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not trying to make a political point here. This is just kind of like a weird psychoanalysis of like the human species and where it is at in its technological development at this point. Because like the behavior that happened on January 6th, when I'm talking about people running around on Instagram with their phones and filming themselves in Nancy Pelosi's office, like this is that behavior for attention like that, utilizing technology and social media to do that is something that, we all do at this point. And it's become so ingrained into our culture, how we perceive each other. That's also why it's difficult to envision some kind of significant like grassroots movement, transforming, the
Hmm.
American political system. And we have become so tame, sleepy from using our technology to keep us comfortable, every day when we come home from work, and then we go and do this, the same thing again the next day, and then, you know, all of a sudden we're retirement age and we still have to keep working, and then you're dead.
Well, and I do wonder at it though that January 6th might be a symptom of an American public that's increasingly less willing to compromise, with the status quo. I don't know that that means that we can organize
Sure.
ourselves for that.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when it seems like the most effective ringleader of that kind of action was a veiled real estate investor turned reality TV star turned president of the United States, right? And so I think that may be the scariest part.
So let's get back to Dreher here. I think what's most devastating about this whole article is that he's just ruining poor, James Pogue's pretty decent article on the machinations of extremist watchers in the media. Pogue points out that, quote, today extremism watching is a boom industry, and I was fortunate to have got in on it early before Trump was elected, because now the race to establish yourself in the field can look frantic. The result is that there's a very real professional incentive not to get to know your subjects too closely, lest you discover something that muddies up the story.
Hmm.
And so the people who make the best living by describing America's descent towards civil violence tend to be those with almost no personal knowledge of the armed rednecks they think are leading us there.
In the remainder of the article, Dreher proceeds to just sort of do the right wing version of what Pogue is talking about there. So, Pogue has just sort of laid out this like feedback loop between the extremist watchers and the extremists. And, but then Dreher turns around and talks about why the left, which is actually just woke capitalist liberalism, is actually a far greater threat to peaceful civic society than, quote, the neckbeard militia members. What Pogue is onto and what Dreher is essentially incapable of interpreting is that the King Ranch Ford F-150 driving neckbeards are exactly as complicit in the decay and deterioration of American society as the liberals he's blaming for America's ills. If civil war comes for America, it'll be because the neckbeards have stopped making $300,000 a year and living in comfortable McMansions. If civil war comes for America, it'll be because there's an actual mechanism for organizing people of modest means against the ruling class, of which Dreher is unquestionably a part. That movement could be right or left, but more likely right. And I think that's what brings us back to where we started in this series. This is a great contradiction on the right, which is that the only people who end up occupying the prestigious heights of conservative commentary are from the same social ranks as liberal pundits. They're the same people. The only difference is how their parents felt about the civil rights movement, and that's fucking it. And so it can be really hard as like a normal person to spot this in the press, because Rod Dreher would have you believe that he has anything other than contempt for everyone who he sees as his social inferior, the same way the liberal pundits do.
It's like we can consider Rod Dreher within the same social class as Rachel Maddow.
Yeah. So. Yeah. But basically the same age. Parents probably like a couple of clicks apart from each other on the political spectrum. There can't be a civil war in the United States because there isn't a coherent division within the ruling class.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the thing about civil war.
The Noam Chomsky quote of him sort of talking about how like American political discourse operates. It's the grand planners, whatever you want to say, they create, the spectrum basically, and then they wall it in and they say here are the two sides, and the political discourse can only operate within, this. And right. These are the people who are carrying out that mission that we're talking about, and they can't go outside that. You can't let the American folks, operate outside that bubble. So
allow for lively debate within those constraints.
Yes. That's
any guy you see with tactical gear and a big spooky gun, is likely going home to his like 10,000 square foot house with 7 different architectural styles and 4 garages, and and he does some ghoulish white collar job, some firm that just like speculates on currency and pushes money around from one place to another, right? Or they're like sort of in like the trade skill management class.
Or he owns a construction company,
right? The trade skill management class. And I think that what Dreher's saying here, and even what liberals are fearing from the right, it basically requires you to be afraid of management class conservatives and their guns and their big trucks, and these are not people who A, have an ideology of transformative change, or B, have any desire in seeing the order of things upended.
That's another thing you can kind of pick out from these people, is like you look at these pictures from the riot, and they are decked out in very expensive gear.
Yep.
Very expensive gear, holding very expensive weapons. So these are not poor folks going there to protest Joe Biden winning the election. And these are people from a much different social class who were there hanging out.
They're from way out in the country, suburban DC, maybe even Virginia, way out there.
Right.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPOD and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.